Conversation and bearing witness. Well, certainly one thing that the Gills programs are doing is connecting kids through their creative work. So there's a real social dimension to the children's art skills activities, and I think in doing creative work in general, kids do loosen up and they become more conversant and they develop a kind of vocabulary and a set of ideas to talk about that don't come up in other kinds of contexts. It normalizes the process of self-expression for boys, which seems to most of them like a highly abnormal thing to do. I shouldn't really talk about these things, or I don't naturally talk about these things, so why not create a context where it just becomes normal for kids to bring up all kinds of different points about their experience? It normalizes insight and communication, and hopefully helps to build what I call self-knowledge. I feel like young people are having all kinds of important life experiences, but they don't get remembered because they don't get archived in some way that allows kids to come back and see the narrative. It's the narrative that's so important, and when we lose experiences that make up your life story, we lose the power and the productivity of that narrative. You need the benefit of those kinds of experiences when you get to be an adolescent, because that's when the world seems so confusing and everything seems arbitrary. And if you approach your life as an adolescent as though it's just a big buffet table and I'll step up and pick whatever dish looks tastiest to me, that is a recipe for unhappiness. I ask kids in my research, what's the thing that you fear most about adulthood? What's your greatest fear about growing up? Everywhere in the world they say the same thing. A fear of being stuck in a job that doesn't feel like me. They don't say, I'm worried I'm not going to make enough money. They don't say, I'm worried I won't be prestigious enough. They say, I'm worried I won't be happy. Which is really another way of saying, I'm worried I won't have a life that's congruent with my core values and self. I'm worried that I won't have a life that matches who I am on the inside. We should take that so seriously. We should talk to kids about that by the time they are 6 and 7 and 8. They're ready for it. They want us to bring that up. They don't want to wait till they're 17, walk down to the guidance office and take a career test and say, okay, looks like I'm going to be a forest ranger. They don't want that, right? They want a more thoughtful, measured process of finding that core self and how do I exist in the world. When you talk to kids and they say, I can imagine myself being a teacher or working in a school, the reason they say that is because most of them have discovered a community at school where people respect one another and they like one another, and there's a palpable sense of love for people and for learning and for the things that we're learning about. And that feels so good to kids, it makes them feel as though I could live in a community like this. There's something special about school in that way. I feel as though I could exist and live here. And so it can't be the only place. Every child can't be a teacher. So we should encourage these other kinds of stories, these other possibilities, and not get so fearful that the only thing we talk to them about is getting a job, you gotta get a job, have a job, 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 job. That's what we say over and over again. Those who are going to be gainfully employed, it's going to happen through no fault of our own. It's just going to happen for them. That's just the way the world is. They find their way. They will find the job that they need to have. What's so important is the other story, is, your individual path. In some of the consulting work that I've done with schools, I've become so concerned about this idea of self-knowledge that I'm having kids build these archive boxes. Oh, thank you, cough drop. Now, the idea of this comes from something that happened when I was in art school, and I was taking a photography class, and we had a new professor who had just come from MIT, and he said to all the students in the class, I want you to go and write a letter to your parents. This is the day before the internet. Write a letter, call your parents, and have them send to the school every single piece of artwork that you ever did since you were born that's been saved. Every scribble, every photo, everything. I want it all. And I also want everything that you've done since you've come to this school. And you're going to have one night that you come into this classroom an hour early, and you put everything up on the walls in chronological order. And we come in an hour later, and we look at it in silence. We don't talk to one another, we just observe. It's not a critique. We're looking for the story. And that moment was an unbelievable time for me because, like most 19-year-olds, I assumed that I was reinventing myself about every 6 months. And that this would just be this big, fragmented, disjointed series of images and scribbles and photos. But that is not the case. There is a narrative that emerges, a story that emerges in forms and in colors and in iconography, and it blew my mind. It blew my mind to think, to see that I had a consistent self that was with me every step of the way. It hadn't gone anywhere. I needed someone to kind of help me step back and see the big story. That changed my life. And so I tried to do this in my consulting work with schools by building these archive boxes. I try to start with kids in the 3rd or the 4th or the 5th grade to build these boxes that will become a repository of important artifacts that are telling their individual story. It can be it could be a report card. It could be a drawing. It could be a great test. It could be some kind of memento from a school trip. I give kids the opportunity to decide what goes in or comes out of the box. But the box stays at the school with the child so long as the child is a student at the school, and it goes with the child when he or she graduates as a senior at the high school level. But the important thing that happens is that the box is unpacked in adolescence. And I have coached schools to have someone who is not a part of the immediate school community to come in with fresh eyes and kind of talk about what they see. Kids need this kind of opportunity. They need that chance to step back and see what their story is. To understand that when you're making the transition to an important life at 17 or 18, it's not arbitrary. You're not really deciding what you're going to do. You're called to do something. But your mind is so busy with chatter, it's hard to hear what it is. Everybody in this room can feel some idea of what this is right now. We have all felt this at some time. When I introduce this idea to kids anywhere, they become so quiet you could hear a pin drop. It's a very exciting idea to think that I am called to do something in life and that it's not just this arbitrary construction of my own will. Because when I'm called to do something, it means that I kind of have a purpose. There's something special that I'm meant to do, and that is true of everyone. But we're not taught to think that way. We're not taught to take the time to reflect on that, and most of us, unfortunately, don't have the privilege of the experiences that would point us toward what that narrative is. That's one reason why creative work is so important. Because if we want to talk about the most efficient way to get to those big themes that really define us and pull us forward and give our life a kind of gravity and a sense of excitement, creative work is one of the most efficient ways to access that. When and why do boys retreat from creativity? About age 15. When I talk to boys before age 15, they're very excited, they're bubbling with the idea of creativity. But around age 15, most of them, I'm done with that. That was part of my childhood, and now I have bigger fish to fry and more serious things to pay attention to. There's a lot more school demands at that time. They start worrying about careers and other kinds of things, about getting into good universities, and they don't feel as though that creative work is career-related enough. It lacks seriousness, and for most, there is not the opportunity for application that's needed. Because when boys get to be around 15 or 16, we do need to find ways for them to apply their creative thinking in the world. They're ready for some significant challenges. So in my consulting work again with schools, I am all the time trying to find activities, problems that need to be solved on a school campus, that kids can be involved in brainstorming and coming up with ideas to solve these real problems. That's what's exciting to them. I talked already about searching for congruity, making sense of stereotypes about masculinity, because this is a huge issue. At one point, I was a scholar in residence at a school in Sydney, Australia, and I taught about 400 ninth grade boys a unit on masculinity, and was really just shocked at how how much conformity there was in these ideas about what masculinity meant, about what a man is, and so forth. So, I mean, there is such a need to explore these kinds of stereotypes, these concepts of masculinity, and kids love to talk about it. You don't have to really twist their arm, you just have to kind of form, a small group, and you have to be serious in how you bring it up. Very serious in how you bring it up. And when we have something like an art-making activity that's a background to the discussion, everything gets better. The conversation is easier because there's less eye contact, and there's something to kind of do with your hands, and so it just really pulls the discussion forward. I've talked already about connecting their ideal and actual selves. A quote from a boy in New Zealand: "I study for my parents and teachers, but I paint for myself. It's me being me, no need to explain." And it helps to answer these important kinds of existential questions like, who am I? For most school-age boys, the most interesting subject they can study is themselves. And they say that. The thing they're most interested in is themselves. They are eager for some kind of a dialogue, a chance to talk about themselves, a vocabulary to kind of work with these issues having to do with their selfhood, helping them to explore what their purpose is, what they should do about different kinds of challenges or decisions that they have to make, and especially a chance to kind of deal with anxiety and depression. Because although it's not said often, when we see adolescents struggling with anxiety and depression, it's mostly always an existential problem. It's almost never the so-called chemical imbalance, which is why most adolescent boys don't want to take medication, is because they know on a deeper intuitive level that that's not really the reason for the anxiety and the depression. The reason is because they've lost their way. That's the reason. They have lost their way. They've lost a sense of what the narrative is, what any of this means. They lose their motivation. They stop working hard. They have lost a sense of what this is all for. And in part, they've lost that because there is, for most, no conversation about those big, important issues. We just talk about, you got to do your best. You got to work hard. You got to keep your nose down. Keep going forward.